The Columbus Blue Jackets are still thinking about Rutger McGroarty. Is there a fit? Can the Jets and Jackets make it work? Find out on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Evening, friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Laine, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you enjoy what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. And just want to take a quick moment to say thank you to all of you who have already subscribed. We have just crossed 900 subscribers as of yesterday. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your support. And we're looking forward to finally hitting our amazing milestone of 1,000. Really couldn't have done it without all of you. So just wanted to take a minute or two and kind of kick off this episode with a thank you to all of you who continue to support and listen. Obviously, I know it's a quieter time of the off season. You know, the Jets have maybe not been super exciting. Let's be real, right? But it sounds like a lot of the league is kind of in a similar spot. There has been not a lot of movement around the NHL recently, but, you know, teams are still doing stuff. And one of those teams apparently is the Columbus Blue Jackets, who are still interested in Rutger McGroarty. Per Aaron Portzline, apparently the Jackets have still been sniffing around and are still wanting to make something happen, which for a lot of reasons is very interesting. The fact that Columbus continues to be in that conversation, we've talked about the Jackets before as being one of those teams that I think has some interesting alignments in terms of players that are maybe slightly dissatisfied with their current role. We've talked about Kent Johnson and David Jiricek, of course, in the past. It sounds like Johnson is more in line with wanting to stay in Columbus. He just wants to sign maybe like a one-year deal, and then he'll come back and sort of renegotiate when things are a little bit more positive. But Jiricek, well, we haven't really heard a lot about him. Is this really a potential destination, and is there a real fit? We'll dive into that in just a quick moment, but before we go any further, just wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and be sure to use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Now, like I said, this is an interesting one because, for a while I wasn't really thinking too much in Columbus's direction, but if there is a fit to be had in terms of McGroarty kind of being not only, an on-ice and locker room leader, but perhaps also maybe like the successor to like a more skilled Boone Jenner, maybe this actually makes a lot of sense from the Blue Jackets' perspective. Columbus has kind of, I would say, waffled around a bit. They're one of those teams that I feel like with the direction the team has gone and sort of the disorganization and chaos that has really plagued this team over the last several years, maybe this is the kind of splash that they feel they need to make in order to get the franchise back on track. Don Waddell obviously has just joined the team. He's really looking to switch things around. He just hired Dean Evason, which, if you remember, Evason was probably a candidate for Winnipeg's open candidacy recently, and I think the Jets probably made the right decision not electing to go his direction, but still a really solid coach. I think Columbus will probably be happy. I do sort of wonder how many times they can kind of go through these Tortorella-style coaches who are, reasonably tough old birds, guys who, are no nonsense and who really are very to the point. But from what I've heard, Evason is actually quite wonderful to be around. I've seen stories about him really going the extra mile to not only work with players, but also staff. So maybe this is the kind of cultural change they really need, because it feels like that team has been adrift for a long time. And even if he might have a dose of tough love, maybe it all works out. But organizationally speaking, McGroarty does make some sense. I think the biggest question is, what comes back? And that's where I've sort of landed on a thought. And a lot of people will probably say it's crazy. Some of you have probably thought about it too, because there is kind of a strange alignment here. But Laine is coming out of player assistance, and it's likely imminent somehow, somewhere in the near future. And we heard a couple weeks ago that the Jets weren't entirely opposed to the idea of something involving Laine. The fact that Winnipeg Sports Talk brought it up, to me, suggests that there's more than just a little bit of smoke to it. Not that it's really possible necessarily, but that there is something to it. And so I was thinking about it, right? How could you make this even happen? Assuming that Jiricek and Rutger might be the centerpieces of this deal, right? Could you make something where you swap Pionk and Laine happen? Is there a chance that maybe Iafallo gets packaged in this deal? Winnipeg needs to move off some salary to make it fit. But if they could potentially swap it out, maybe you solve not only one of your big prospect challenges in terms of finding a really talented young blue liner with a lot of potential, but also you bring back Laine, who's a big goal scorer, who would immediately upgrade Winnipeg's top six. And in a lot of ways, it kind of seems to be, I don't know if it makes a lot of sense as like an ideal fit, but for the Jets, they move off some salary for this season, although they do, they obviously replace it with Laine's contract. But I think for Columbus, they get out of 1 year of it, right? Which is a fairly big amount of savings. Maybe the Jets make it somehow like a three-way so that another team retains some of Patrick's contract. If you make his cap hit closer to like 6.7 million or something, and you pay somebody else to eat part of it, I sort of wonder how that would all work out. But because you have to do so much engineering here, I don't know how realistic it is. I think that there are some legitimate questions as to, how much value you can really work around here, right? Because Laine is at this point in his career a cap dump. I love him dearly, and I think he would actually have a bit of a resurgence with the Jets, but it's hard to say that he'd really be worth the current contract. And, with Winnipeg needing to get a pretty good return for Rutger and also figure out a way to work around some of the contracts that they have expiring that are a little too rich for Winnipeg's blood, I just don't know, right? I continue to kind of run up against some walls where I'm like, this sounds nice in theory, doesn't seem all that realistic. But the fact that Columbus continues to be interested and Laine is apparently imminent to return to NHL status, which means he could start talking to teams again. And apparently he does actually hold Winnipeg in fairly high regard. It just makes you think a little bit, right? The wheels turn a bit. If Jiricek is part of this package and Laine somehow returns home, I think a lot of Winnipeg fans, myself included, would be thrilled. I'd have to see what the full package looks like. But if you're talking about a player that, for a lot of Jets fans continues to capture our imaginations and our spirits and would honestly just be a wonderful player to have back in the organization and somebody that would probably sell tickets, Laine is kind of that guy. And there was a version of him that played for Columbus that really rounded out his two-way game. He had, taken on a lot more defensive responsibility. And I think he grew in transition in a way that we hadn't really seen with the Jets. Obviously, injuries have kind of marred that a bit, so I don't know what he'll be like if he comes back to Winnipeg. But all that to say, there's an interesting alignment, and I'd be curious to know what sort of package comes out of that. Again, it is a little fanciful. Of the teams that I think are after McGroarty, I think Columbus is a little further down the pecking order, but again, if we're talking about a fit, maybe they're closer to the top in terms of, a team that would really love Rutger and probably make a lot of sense as a destination. So if there's incentive for them to get this done, I'm just saying, think about it. I'd be curious to know your thoughts on that, though. Give me your assessment of what a Rutger McGroarty to Columbus trade might look like. Let me know who you'd be after. Maybe you still think Johnson would be a part of it. Maybe there's somebody else that you're interested in. I can tell you it's probably not going to be Sillinger. He is likely to sign a multi-year deal. But hey, you never know. Crazier things have happened. But, if Portsline is sort of suggesting that is where things stand, then I would say of all those players, Jiricek might be the one that you are most likely to target. Now, speaking of multi-year deals for young players, the Jets have gotten some interesting news as per Mike McIntyre. As per one of our wonderful reporters, Scott Billick, that Cole Perfetti might actually be willing to come back on a multi-year deal. We'll talk about that in just a little bit because that obviously plays a huge role in Winnipeg's offseason. But before we go too much further, just wanted to shout out our friends and partners at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience, the formula for winning championships, is also what keeps your vehicle alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Just like building a championship team requires a carefully picked out, hand-selected roster, something that has synergy and works well together, well, eBay Motors is very much the same way. They offer you a great selection of everything from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or you get your money back. With eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge victories. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. Hey friends, and welcome back to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're just chatting about some interesting updates with some of Winnipeg's young players and prospects. Finally starting to see McGroarty conversation pop up again. And amidst all of that, Scott Billick also had a bit of a tidbit. He put out an article earlier about Cole Perfetti. And one of the nuggets that was, I think, most intriguing is that Cole Perfetti might actually be willing to sign for multiple seasons. We'll talk about why I think that could be a benefit for both parties and what sort of term Perfetti might be into in just one sec. But for all of you Fox Sports or ESPN watchers, if you find yourselves having to turn down the volume because there's too much shouting, you should make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you daily to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. All part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, returning back to the Jets and Perfetti. So the intimation that Perfetti might be willing to sign for multiple years for me is very interesting. At this point, Cole hasn't really had a strong run with Winnipeg consistently. He's had seasons where he's played a decent number of games, but you look at his time on ice deployments, you look at the role he's been given, he wasn't really provided a prime starring spot with this team, which is kind of not what his agent and he himself seemingly expected, especially at the start of this past season. Now, with Bones gone and, Arniel basically making overtures to Perfetti saying, look, you're part of our team for the future. You're somebody that we're planning to build around. To me, I think on paper, at least, there's a lot of reason for Perfetti to feel reassured that this year's going to be different. And the fact that we have, quite a few roster spots that are going to be open, quite a few battles coming out of camp that suggests a player like Perfetti would have a really big chance to get a big spot with the squad. You start to see why there's a real reason for him to think about his place with the team with a little bit of term. Now, the other part of me totally gets it if he's not ready to commit, right? Let's say worst case scenario, he wants to bridge. If that's the case, obviously you would expect a raise in about 2 years. That's going to be pretty significant. A bridge is not ideal if you're the Jets, but I mean, it's not the end of the world. You basically would just have to make the most of those next 2 seasons or so while you figure out what his longer term extension is going to be. But there is the suggestion, apparently, that Perfetti would be willing to sign a longer term deal, which, based on Byfield getting, a 5-year contract, I sort of wonder if that's what he saw and if he's kind of thinking the same thing. This, again, could be coming from the Jets themselves, and maybe they're trying to influence Perfetti to think about this route. But Cole is, like 22 or so. 4 or 5 years from now, he'll be at UFA status once he hits 27. I forget when his exact birthday is. But it's, whatever that term is, if he signs a deal that basically gets him through that period, right? And you pay him in the neighborhood of $5.5 to $6 million for 5 years. I kind of think that actually works nicely for both teams. You're making a bit of a gamble and a bet that Perfetti is going to be worth it. But based on what we've seen from him and some of that growth that we've started to see over the past, season with him, I think it's a pretty fair bet that it'll age pretty nicely. He's a player that I think you can give a reasonably heftier contract to, and you'll probably expect him to live up to it. From Perfetti's perspective, you get cash certainty, you get a really nice salary, and you have that contract until you hit UFA status, which, maybe it's not going to be for 7 or 8 years, but if you get it for 5, I think it works kind of nicely because at the end of 5 years, you might be due for a big raise. It's a decent bet. I think for both sides, it gives the Jets and Perfetti ample time to figure out what his overall role is and, kind of see what his growth potential is with this team. And if things really go south, the contract could be movable in the worst case scenario, but I suspect that at the end of it, we'll be looking at a big, 6 or 7 year Perfetti extension. I have a lot of faith in him. He's one of those players that you've heard me talk about time and time again. He is a huge piece of this core. I continue to really believe in him. I guess the only question is, where does he play? And that'll be interesting this upcoming season, right? Does he play down the middle? I've always thought from the start that at some point he would get a longer look at the center role. And he's had a couple of runs there. He hasn't really had it recently, but with the Jets not really having a clear answer to the 2C question, I wonder if they go back to that and try to figure it out. Again, it's not like it's a question that they have zero solutions for. Winnipeg does have players who could technically handle the second line center role, and they might also trade for somebody should this whole McGroarty thing pan out in that direction, or maybe even the Ehlers deal, pending what happens with all of that. But I don't know. Something about the whole Perfetti thing makes me think that he might be the person they would like to give that shot to first to see what happens. And if he really does run with it, then you kind of have answered one of your biggest questions. Where's the second line center coming from? Well, if you got it internally, you don't even have to worry about it. And if you get him for the next 4 or 5 years, however many years he's thinking about for a longer term contract, I think it works out nicely for everyone. It carries him through, the biggest years of Hellebuck's remaining career, most likely, probably the same for Scheifele. And at the end of it, then he might be able to take on the mantle of that next core Scheifele-esque presence on this team. So I guess the biggest question is, what does he want to do? Is he interested in bridging and betting, or does he want to take the guaranteed salary and stick around for a reasonable amount of time before he starts thinking about a raise? From Winnipeg's perspective, having that cost certainty on a player who is looking more and more like a top talent, it's great, right? Then you can start to game plan around it. You've got one of your pieces locked up for the foreseeable future, and it allows you to start working around the margins and building out the rest of your team. Obviously, he's not going to be like a McKinnon level player, but you're talking about a guy who, again, I have a lot of faith as being really freaking good. I've maintained basically from the day that he was drafted that I believed he had the potential to be one of Winnipeg's star players. Maybe he won't shine in the way that some others do, but watching him, he's so smart. He's incredibly thoughtful, and he seems like a player who really comes to the rink ready to grind his butt off. And I'm excited for him. I think this year has the potential to be really big for him. I continue to root for him. It's not like I really want to root against any particular players. There are just some guys who I just naturally gravitate towards. And a player like Perfetti, who for me I really, see the world for him coming to fruition this year. This is a season that I think he'll remember, and I'm hoping that he kicks it off this off season with a big extension. I would love that. I think for a lot of reasons, there's some symmetry, but I also understand if part of him is a little cautious before he wants to commit. There is probably a reasonable chance that he wants to do the bridge, but again, if he's open to it and that's coming out of all of this already, I would be pretty down. Again, I think both scenarios you can work around it, but if there's a way to get him signed up with term, oh, you got to do it. I really feel like that's a smart gamble. I think the Byfield contract continues to be a great comparable. And if you get that same similar contract locked up, I think you are having a fantastic offseason, right? Again, I said on the last episode, I gave this offseason so far like a B minus. I think a Perfetti deal with term, which didn't really seem like it was all that possible last year, that'd be a massive turnaround, and I think a real testament to Winnipeg perhaps making some bigger changes and willing to play the kids and put their money where their mouth is. I think that's a really big move for the team. I think it's a big growing up step, and if they actually live up to it, I will give the Jets their roses here and applaud them. I think that's a big thing. I think it's how they should have been from the start. I know it's probably taken a little bit longer for us to get back to this point, but you know what? It is better late than never. Now, thinking all of this in the context of the conversation we just had about McGroarty and Laine, what happens if you get the gang back together? What would this team potentially look like? Obviously, this is this is very speculative. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. There is much that would have to happen for all of this to even remotely occur. But let's talk about what would happen if somehow Laine and the gang all reunite and the Jets start to look a little more like what their actual draft selections have been. We'll talk about that in just a quick minute, but before we go too much further, just wanted to shout out tonight's title sponsors at Game Time. When it comes to buying tickets, a lot of you are used to getting hit with surprise fees, big charges, and sometimes when you're buying tickets, you look at a seat map and you think, yeah, I have a rough idea of where I'm sitting, but you know what? You're not really sure what the view's like. I bought tickets one time to a Blink-182 concert, and I looked at the seat map and it looked like a decent sideways view, but when I got to my seat, I was having to crane my neck at a really strange angle just to see the stage. Game Time has been there themselves. They totally get it. They know it sucks. And that's why they want to offer you a great platform with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, and views from your seat. Really important for those of you who don't want to have an obstructed view. All backed with their lowest price guarantee and event cancellation protection. It's why they've now become an authorized ticket marketplace for Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Best of all, prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to the first pitch or start of your event. Whether you're looking for concerts or sporting events, no matter what, they've got a great selection. And of course, they come with zone deals, flash sales, last-minute price drops, all that fun stuff that you really enjoy. We all love saving time and money, and Game Time is great to take the guesswork out of buying any sort of tickets, whether it's MLB or something else. So download the Game Time app, create an account, and be sure to use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Hey friends, and welcome back to these closing thoughts on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're just wrapping up with some thoughts on one thing that I've kind of considered, and I'm not trying to get too ahead of things, but it's the off season. The Jets haven't done a lot recently. And with all the rumors starting to heat up again as teams are getting closer and closer to preseason, you start thinking about what happens if certain trades and things go through. And one of those is obviously a return for Patrik Laine to Winnipeg. Again, I don't really think that this is all that likely, and I'm not trying to put a load of stock into it. But the other part of me is thinking about what happens if it does occur. If Laine, comes out of player assistance, and he wants to return to Winnipeg. Look, man, I continue to really think that there could be a potential fit. I mean, obviously the salary is a little bit of a question mark. And so I don't want to say that this is likely, but if it does happen, how would the Jets arrange themselves? I think you have a big question because part of it really depends on what you do with Ehlers. But if Laine comes back, maybe that changes the thinking with Nick's own, long-term picture with the team, right? Because right now he's not asking for a trade, but the Jets have been shopping him, and there's been some discussion that he's not really hot to trot to re-sign. And it's not surprising. I know Arneal thinks pretty highly of him, but Ehlers himself really hasn't been given priority, and unlike Hellebuck and Scheifele, Ehlers has always been second fiddle on this team's deployments, right? He's not given the number one billing, and so there's not really a reason for him to stick around. But if Laine comes back, maybe that starts to change things. Now, how you put all of this together is kind of a challenge. Assuming that you would have Ehlers, Scheifele, and Vilardi as your first line, you'd have a dominant first line, zero question. The second line is where I start to run into some challenges, right? Because you want to have Laine most likely somewhere in your top six. I would think you'd probably be looking at something like, I don't know, Connor, Perfetti, and Laine. I do have some stylistic issues with that. Perfetti and Laine, much love to them. They're not the fastest skaters. And Connor does kind of need certain conditions to be really successful. I think that there's a way to make Connor and Perfetti really shine with somebody who's maybe a little bit speedier on the right side. I think that duo has worked well together, and I'd be curious to know if Laine could maybe keep up. If he can, and if that's really the best fit, I think you would have a really dominating dynamite top six. Again, there's a lot of speculation here, and it really would be an interesting question. Laine is such a powerful shooter, and with Perfetti's smarts in passing and Connor's own one-on-one matchup ability, maybe you could make it work, right? But if it doesn't, maybe you look at a Connor, Perfetti, and Nemesnikov arrangement somehow, whether it's Nemesnikov at center or it's Perfetti, one of those two. As long as Connor and Perfetti are together, I think it would be fine. But if Lowry has to be the guy that you play Laine with, maybe that solves, one of the biggest questions with your third line for the next couple of seasons. Who could be a bigger finisher for that unit? And would it make, better use of Lowry's ice time? Because he does play quite a bit. He's had at times second line minutes on this team, and I don't think you want him to play that much. But if you play him with Niederreiter and Laine, you might finally have a line that actually takes advantage of all those chances they create, right? The Lowry line constantly buzzes, but they don't actually score that much. They're one of the biggest differentials between expected goals and actual goals. And so Laine would actually be a potential fix to that. I think it might be an interesting stylistic fit. You might really start to see Lowry's beast game actually get rewarded because he's constantly setting up chances. But I love Nino and I love Appleton, but let's be real, right? If you put Laine in either of their positions, you are getting a top-tier shooter with a release that might actually make a noticeable outsized difference. At that point, your fourth line can be basically whatever. The Jets have a whole slew of guys. I don't know if Iafallo is likely to be one of them. We'll have to see what he does because the Jets may need to move his salary to make something like this even happen. But if you have a fourth line of Appleton, Gustafson, Barron, again, at that point, I don't even really care. Your top nine is so good that you don't really have to worry too much about the fourth. You're going to have a good one almost no matter how you arrange it. So I don't want to fantasize too much, but I'm starting to think about it a little bit more because, the Jets are actively making some moves. They're really thinking about it. And maybe it just ends up that McGroarty doesn't go anywhere and maybe he even signs with the Jets. I think that'd be the really funniest timeline out of all of this is if he sticks around and ends up signing his deal. But I think at that point, it's probably already far, far too gone. So we'll have to think about how that all fits in. There's not many other teams that I think are going to be great trade partners for what the Jets want. And obviously, even trying to fit Laine is a bit of a challenge. I'm not going to lie. It is a bit of a challenge. But and this is the silly season. This is when you get to think about these things and have a little bit of fun. And I think all of us get a little bit romantic when we think about Patrick Laine in a Winnipeg Jets uniform. Do you still do? Let me know in the comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's show, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. We'll continue to provide even more off-season coverage, maybe thinking about some of the other potential trade fits that still are out there. Still a lot of teams that might be interested in McGroarty. But like I said, for tonight's episode, that's going to be all the time that we have. Thanks so much for listening and making us your first listen of the day, every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow with more Jets off-season coverage, so don't go anywhere. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.